Oh, I didn't see you there. Welcome to another magical adventure of Econ 112. This is the second part of Chapter 6. We're going into taxes today, so let's learn about taxes. You know, it's the little things that give me joy through this process. All right, let's go ahead and switch over to screen 2. Let's expand this out and let's go ahead and get started about taxes. So, we know about taxes, right? Everything you legally earn and most things you buy end up being taxed. You know, unless you're like babysitting or some other illegal activity that doesn't necessarily get their taxes taken out. But most of the time, pretty much everything you earn and all the things you buy are going to end up being taxed. But who really pays the taxes, right? Income tax and the Social Security tax, those are deducted from your pay. And the state tax is added to the price of things that you buy. But what happens to prices? What happens to all the other pieces? When you pay Social Security, your company also pays into Social Security and matches a lot of your contributions. They put into unemployment insurance. You know, your sales tax, that might be partially offset by reducing the price of the item or raising the price of the item if we get rid of a sales tax. So the problem is, it's not necessarily obvious who pays for the tax. I might say that the tax is on the seller. I might say that the tax is on the buyer. But who pays it at the end of the day is actually a very difficult thing to answer, which is really going to be dependent on what the structure of the market demand and the market supply look like. So the first piece of language that you need is the idea of tax incidence. A tax incidence is the division of the burden of a tax between buyers and sellers. So some of the tax might be put on the buyers, some of the tax might be put on the sellers. And there's going to be differences in between the two. We have to figure out what this tax incidence is to know what the incidence on one party versus the other is. When an item is taxed, its price might rise by the full amount of a tax. It might rise by less than the tax. Let's say I went to the people who made, let's say I go to Sharpie, because I just bought these S gels. People kept talking about in a meme about how awesome Sharpie S gels were. They were wrong, by the way. The Pilot G2 gel pens are still significantly better. These are terrible, and now I have a whole box that I have to deal with. But anyways, Sharpie S pens. So let's say that we're talking about the Sharpie S pens. If we put a tax on them, right? Because I think these were like, I don't know, $7. Let's say that they're $7. The government comes in and I'm like, ooh, that's a terrible pen. So we're going to have to pay for all the economic damages that this pen has caused Dr. Plemmmons in her therapy. So we're gonna tax you. Maybe for each box of these you sell, you got to put $1 into the damages of the S pen fund. All right. Okay, well, they went to the seller and said that they had to pay a tax. What does the seller do? Well, they now have to pay a $1 tax, which means this $7 item, if it continues to be sold for $7, they only get to keep $6 and $1 has to go to the government. Well, they're probably like, do I want to do that? That's really expensive. That's a seventh of the money I'm making. How about I raise the price of these pens to $7.50? Then 50 cents, that price jump, that's really the consumers. They're going to be paying that. And I'm going to take that 50 cents and I'm going to give it to the government. Then I'm going to take 50 cents out of the $7 I would have already made. So now I'm really making $6.50 at the end of the day. I'm going to take 50 cents and put it towards the government. So that way the taxes are actually split in between the two. Sometimes they might do it by a greater amount. Sometimes they might do it by a smaller amount. If the market price rises by the full amount of a tax, and that means that the buyer pays the tax. If instead of $7 a box, I raised it to $8 a box, that means the consumer is paying that entire $1 tax because it's now $1 more expensive for them. But if I keep it at $7, okay, so I have the $7 box of pens, and I think the pens are atrocious, and I know that they're atrocious, and I know that people won't pay more than $7. So instead, I just take $6 in my bank account and give $1 to the government, but I don't raise the price at all. Then me, as the seller, I'm paying the entire tax. But the thing is, those two extremes don't always necessarily happen. It tends to be that the tax goes to both people, and this is called the incidence of the tax. So let's talk about what the kind of equivalence of putting a tax on a buyer versus putting the tax on the seller is. Putting the tax on the seller says, hey, for every single one of these you sell, you need to put X amount into the tax fund. Okay, a tax on the buyer says, you're buying this. Well, when you take it to the register, you're going to have this additional tax added to it, and that's going to go to the fund. What are these? Are these equivalent or not? So let's talk about Maryland. So Maryland ended up putting like a $3 tax on cigarettes. So the people of Maryland, they wanted to discourage cigarette smoking. They're like, you know what, this isn't good. This is a lot of just not good stuff for people's lungs. We're not very happy with this. We would like people to stop smoking. So let's tax it. Well, they want to know whether they should make the seller, the people who are selling the cigarettes, pay the tax, or if they should tax the buyer, the people who are buying the cigarettes. What we're going to see is that it doesn't necessarily matter which side of the market you put it on. What matters is the shape of the market. So let's talk about that. Let's say that we originally put the tax on sellers. Okay, if we put a $3 tax on sellers, what's going to happen? Well, let's look at these two blue lines. We have our downward sloping demand and our upward sloping supply. Our original market equilibrium, when there's no taxes whatsoever, is that 350 packs of cigarettes are sold at $6. That's what it would be if we had no taxes in the system whatsoever. Now, when we implement a tax, we raise the line by that much. So the supply line right here, we raise it up, we push it upwards by the $3 of the tax. So now, if we had the same 350 million packs, instead of $6, if we were at that same quantity, it would actually be $9. It is increased by $3 because of that tax. But where is the new equilibrium? So we have this new supply plus the tax on sellers. The new equilibrium, though, is right here. Notice that that's not at $9. The new place where the market ends up is not necessarily with a $9 pack of cigarettes, right? In this, we actually see that this is closer to $8 with slightly less cigarettes sold. Let's start to fill this in a little bit more. Well, if we take this new equilibrium, let's trace it over to the price. The price that the buyer is going to pay is $8. Okay, that means that these $6 cigarettes are now $8. We see that because that's the difference between the equilibrium price before the tax and the equilibrium price after the tax. Now let's look at what happens to quantity. We see that the quantity of cigarettes does go down. Okay, all right. So originally 350 packs of cigarettes were sold, or 350 million, and now it's 325 million. Now, this $8 that these buyers are paying, that's not all going to go to the business, right? Because there's still this $3 tax that has to end up in the government paycheck or in the government bank. So this $8 packs of cigarettes, well, out of that $8, $3 goes to the government. So we have $3 that goes to the government. That means 8 minus 3, this is $5 remaining for the seller. So we find this by taking this new equilibrium. We take this new equilibrium and we trace a line down to our original supply curve, and then we look over. We trace it back over to the price. We see at this 325 million, well, this $3 difference, this goes to the government. So this, what's left for the seller, the people selling the cigarettes, is this $5. Buyers pay $8, $3 go to the government, seller gets $5. That's not necessarily that the price went up by $3. So it's all on the consumer. Price only went up by $2. Only part of it's on the buyers. It wasn't necessarily that the seller decided to pay all of it out of their pockets. They didn't keep the price $6 and just handed $3 to the government. They instead raised the price a little bit and then gave some to the government, but they still paid part of it themselves out of their original amount of money. All right, so what buyers pay is more than the non-tax price, and what sellers actually get at the end of the day is less than the no tax price. We see that the tax is $3 because that's how much the thing went up. All right. Now let's say we did it to the buyers. So that was the perspective of putting the tax on the sellers, because we're like, we're going to put it on the people who sell the cigarettes. Okay, let's do it the other direction. Let's say, we're going to put it on the people who buy the cigarettes. Every time you go to the register, there's going to be an additional $3 of taxes that show up that the buyers are going to have to pay. Well, let's see what happens in that situation. Well, we have our original supply and demand, right? In our original supply and demand, before there's any taxes whatsoever, we see that there were 350 million people buying cigarettes at $6 a pack. This was our no tax price. If we're putting a tax on the supply, or excuse me, on the buyers, that brings down the demand curve, right? So this demand curve shifts down by $3. That means we have $6 right here. We're pushing it down by $3. So now at 350 million packs, if we take this new demand curve and we bring it over, we see $3. What does that necessarily mean? This line right here is the demand minus the tax that's going to be put on the buyers. Let's fill this in a little bit more. Okay, so we see that we have this tax that's now put on the buyers because they don't like taxes. They're like, well, if I'm going to have a $3 tax, well, let's see, at this point, I was originally willing to pay $6. Well, if I have a $3 tax, no matter what, I have to pay $3 to the government. Then at that amount, if the original price is $6, I would want to pay $3 plus a $3 tax because that equals $6, right? $3 paying for the cigarettes was a $3 tax. That equals the $6 you originally were willing to pay. So we have this $3 people are really willing to pay at that point if they have a $3 tax. Now let's go to the new equilibrium because that was the original equilibrium. The new equilibrium, we see that we have an intersection. We see that we now have $5 that would go to the seller because we're willing to pay $5, right? At this reduced quantity of 325 million. So 25 million people no longer buy cigarettes, and we have this. Okay, all right, so the sellers are going to get $5. But what does that mean that we actually pay? Well, we're paying the $5 for the cigarettes, but there's $3 that are going to be in taxes, right? So we trace this line up from this new equilibrium, we trace it to the original line, and we see that that would intersect our quantity demand at $8 for 325 million. This difference in between this new equilibrium and the line that we have for our original demand curve, this is the difference of our taxes. So we see at the end of the day, when we put the tax on the buyers pay $8, $3 goes to government, and the brain fart, and the seller gets $5. Well, that's the exact same thing we saw earlier, right? Let's go back. When we put the tax on the sellers, we saw the buyers pay $8. $3 went to the government. The seller keeps $5. Whoa, 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 what? What? Well, that's because they're just identical. It doesn't matter if you put the tax on the buyer. It doesn't matter if you put the tax on the seller. What matters is the angle of the lines. It's kind of cool, right? If I shift one of them up and down, or I shift the other one up and down, their relationship to each other is still going to be determined by what angle these lines had. That's neat. That's neat. When I first realized this was the moment I realized I wanted to study taxes for a living, which is why I'm a public economist. So, I already explained all of this. Taxes act as a wedge. This angle right here in between this demand curve and the supply curve, that reflects how elastic people are, right? Because remember, the angle of supply, that was pretty similar to what the elasticity was going to be for those suppliers, how sensitive they were to price changes. Then the angle of this demand curve, well, that kind of represents how elastic people's demand is for a change in prices. Now let's say we have a situation where suppliers, they're pretty inelastic. They're gonna supply the same no matter what. And then we have buyers. Let's say that they're very elastic. The price changes at all and they're running out the door. Well, what happens in that situation? Well, the buyers aren't necessarily going to pay the tax, because if you try putting the tax on them and they have to pay $3 more, they're going to say no. And then they leave. But if you put it on the sellers who are relatively inelastic, well, they were going to produce about the same, whether it was expensive or not expensive to produce. Who do you put the tax on? The person that's going to run away or the person that's going to pay it? You put it on the person. Yeah, right? You end up with the same situation, because it doesn't matter if you put it on the buyer or the seller. What matters is the behavior of the buyer and the seller to where the incidence of the tax actually is. So taxes act as a wedge, right? That drive right in between the price the buyer's actually paying and the price the seller actually receives. And that difference in between what the buyer pays and what the seller gets, that's the tax. That's the money that's going to a completely different economic system, and it's the economic system of governments. So let's see what that would look like, right? Let's say that we have a $3 tax. Well, notice in both of our examples, there was the difference in between what the buyer pays and what the seller gets. That's going to be equal to $3. We can kind of figure out the nice cheat sheet way of figuring out tax incidence is we start at our equilibrium and we keep moving leftwards until we get to the point where the difference in between our supply curve and our demand curve, let's say it's about $1 right here, it's about $2 right here, and then right here, the difference is $3. The tax is $3, okay? So we stop when we go to the left and we get to the point where the difference in between supply and demand is equal to that tax, because we know the tax is $3. Let's see what the economic implications are. If we know the tax is $3, that means that our quantity demand is here, quantity supply is here, buyer pays $8, we trace it over to the price line, then we go down to the supply line, we trace that over, the seller gets $5 because the buyer's paying $8, but $3 leaves the system and goes somewhere else to the government. So that $3 is left, sellers can't have that, right? So the sellers get $5. With a tax, the equilibrium quantity is no longer at the intersection of the demand and the supply. The equilibrium quantity is wherever you move to the point where the distance in between these two lines is equal to the amount of the tax. The equilibrium quantity is just equal to what that vertical gap is and it relative to the tax. And we see by the slope of the two lines which one is going to affect more. So there's some parts of efficiency with taxes, right? Are taxes necessarily efficient? Well, are they? Let's look back at this original chart. Well, let's think about the pieces because we know we have producer surplus, consumer surplus, deadweight loss. Let's start with producer surplus. Well, let's go along this supply line. Okay, at this point, at 275 million, suppliers would be willing to sell that many for about $3. But if they're really getting $5 at the end of the day, that's a good deal for them. It's not as good of a deal as if they got $6, but they get $5. It's still a good deal. So on and so forth. We see that this triangle right here, this is our producer surplus. Now that's smaller than if it had been all the way up to $6, where it's half of the big triangle. It's not half of the big triangle, it's less than that because we now have this inefficiency induced. Producer surplus gets smaller. What about consumer surplus? Well, maybe this person right here, if there was only 275 million packs of cigarettes, they would have been willing to pay a lot because there's a shortage or something. So maybe they'd be willing to pay $12, but they really pay $8. Well, $12 to $8, that's a good deal. They get some happiness. They get some consumer surplus from that. Not as much as if they had paid $6. They'd be much happier with $6, but $8, they're still pretty happy. And we see that so on and so forth until we get to the person who's willing to pay $8.01. They get a little teeny 1 cent of happiness. But the person who's willing to pay $7.99, no, they're out. They're not happy anymore. So consumer surplus, this top triangle, that also gets smaller. So producer surplus and consumer surplus get smaller. Now, what happens in the rest of the chart? Well, we have this big rectangle in the middle that I didn't talk about, right? Notice that the difference in price for this big rectangle, this is in between $5 and $8. This is in between what the seller gets and what the buyer pays. That money has to go somewhere. It goes to the government. So $3 for each pack of cigarettes goes to the government. That means for this 275th, that's $3 to the government. For this 300th, that's $3 to the government. For this 325, that's $3 to the government. That $3 times the quantity. So the price times the quantity equals the total revenue for the government, right? So this $3 price times the 325 million packs, that makes this rectangle. That's going to be the government revenue from this, right? That's the tax revenue. Notice that there's a little triangle right here that we no longer use. This is our deadweight loss. That's the trades for that 348th pack of cigarettes that someone would have been willing to pay like $6.25 for, and someone would have been willing to sell it for $5.75, but with taxes, those don't exist anymore. So we have deadweight loss. This is loss in the happiness or the producer surplus of producers, and the happiness or the consumer surplus of consumers. This is the loss in surplus to the system, right? So let's do that again. Let's talk about if we had a $200 tax on computers. So, I mean, I'm sure most of you, I mean, you definitely have had to go computer shopping lately, right? You're taking an online course. So, or a course that at least has online attributes and is heavily dependent on Blackboard. So, I mean, you have to have a computer or use a computer somewhere. So what happens if there's a $200 tax? Well, okay, let's say that normally, if we had no taxes on computers, we would sell computers for about $600 and we'd sell about 5 million of them. But now we introduce a $200 tax. Well, we go from this equilibrium middle point, we go to the left until the difference in between our demand and supply equals 200. Boom, we hit that right here. Okay, all right, this difference is 200. Let's trace this down. That's 3 million tablets that are getting sold. Okay, and there's a $200 tax. That means the difference in between the prices that consumers are paying and the amount that ends up in the producer bank account, this difference is 200. So we see at the top, we have consumer surplus. Consumer surplus has gotten smaller. It's a smaller triangle now. That's because these people would have had a lot of consumer surplus if they were paying $600. But at the end of the day now, they're now paying $700, as we can see from our new point on our demand line, right? So it's not as good of a deal, but some people are still happy. Consumer surplus gets smaller. Now, they might be paying 700, but 200 is going to the government. So there's only 500 really going to the suppliers. Well, some of them might be happy with that $500 price. They're not as happy as if you had been handing them $600 for each tablet or computer, but 500, some of them are still happy. We see that producer surplus has also gotten smaller. Now, we also have those additional 2 points, right? This $200 difference times those 3 million computers, that makes this rectangle right here, which is the tax revenue. That's the money going to government. Then we have our triangle that's created. It's the trades in between the 3 million tablets and the 5 million tablets that are no longer happening in this society. So that's called the deadweight loss. It's the loss in consumer and producer surplus to the system. All right, so tax incidence really depends on the elasticity that's associated with the demand or supply curve. So the division of the tax between buyers and sellers depends on the elasticities of demand and supply. If I'm really, really responsive to a price change, then they're not going to raise the price on me for a good, right? Because they're like, oh, well, if we're putting in a tax and we raise the price, then they're not going to be there anymore. So the seller's going to take it. If I'm really inelastic, if they know this is something that I'm going to buy, whether it is $5 or $500, then they'll put the tax on me as the consumer, right? The supplier will just raise their price and put more of it on me because they know that I'm going to pay for it regardless of what the price is. So that sort of relationship matters. Two things that are really important, because this is a question that I ask you on your test and people tend to get it wrong. If it's a perfectly inelastic demand, if I am willing to pay whatever price it is for exactly that amount, I want 5 cups of coffee and I do not care if this cup of coffee is $10 or $500, the buyer's going to pay the entire tax. You're going to put the entire tax on that person because they're willing to pay anything anyways. So why not just raise the price for the amount of the tax and have them pay for it? The buyers pay the entire tax in a perfectly inelastic demand system. Perfectly elastic though, if I'm like, I am willing to pay $2.50 for this cup of tea, you charge me $2.51 and I'm walking out that door. I am not okay with that, right? Okay, so if the price changes at all and I'm leaving, you don't want to raise the price on those people. So what's going to happen in that situation? Well, the seller looks at it and they're like, wow, okay, this new tax, it sucks. I don't want to do that. But we know if we raise the price that we're going to lose our customers. So I'm going to take the entire part of the tax. The tax all comes out of my pocket because I cannot adjust what the people are paying at the register. A really interesting caveat to this is what happens if the tax is put on the buyer. We give it as a sales tax. It's a sales tax, and there's a person who says, if I pay more than $2.50 at the register, I'm walking out the door. Well, the sellers are going to have to lower their price at that point. They're like, oh no, we can't have them paying more than $2.50 at the register, and our coffee's $2.50, and there's a tax now. Okay, let's make our coffee actually just $2, and then there's going to be the tax that takes up $2.50, and that's what they pay. The sellers might have to lower their cost or their price, yeah, which makes it work out so there's the same amount of tax revenue. It doesn't matter which side of the market you put it on. There's going to be an adjustment so that that person with the perfectly elastic demand consuming something doesn't pay the tax. The seller pays the entire tax in those situations. So the more inelastic the demand, so the more I'm willing to pretty much pay any price, the larger the buyer's share of the tax. I will pay a higher percentage of the tax if I am not price sensitive and I plan to pay this no matter what it is. Then more the tax goes on me. So let's look at what that looks like. Remember, inelastic, straight up and down. It looks like an I, right? So in inelastic, we have the straight up and down. I'm willing to pay for this, what is this, doses per day? I don't remember what this example is. So we're going to say it's a dose of caffeine. I'm willing to pay $2 for my dose of caffeine, or I'm willing to pay $2.20 for my dose of caffeine. Doesn't matter. I need it regardless because I cannot teach if I am not caffeinated. So they know that I'm relatively inelastic. Well, that means that me as the buyer, I'm going to pay the entire tax, right? If this supply line shifts upwards, well, we're at the same quantity. I'm just going to take the entire tax. If we put it on the buyer, well, it just raises where we are on this line. I'm going to pay the entire tax. What about perfectly elastic? What if it's the other way? What if it's the point where I'm like, I will pay $2.50 for this cup of coffee, and if you charge me 1 penny more, it's not happening. Actually, in this one, it's $1. So let's say I'm paying $1, you charge me 1 penny more, it's not happening. Well, then if I put in a tax, on the register, and I'm like, oh no, the customer's going to leave if they pay more than $1. I'm going to have to drop my price so that with taxes, they don't pay more than $1. The seller takes the tax. Or let's say we go to the seller, we put the tax on the seller, and then the seller's like, I know that they won't pay more than $1 for that cup of coffee. I'm gonna have to pay this tax out of pocket. I can't change the price. Seller takes the entire tax. The more willing I am to leave the store, or us as consumers that we are to leave the store, the less of taxes get put on us and the more it has to be put on the sellers. So to see the effect of elasticity of supply, so we were talking about changes in demand then. What happens if it's an elastic demand versus an inelastic demand? But what about on the supply side? Because supply has elasticity, right? There's going to be changes in how much I'm willing to produce relative to price changes. So here's another 2 examples, right? So we had the perfectly elastic demand and the perfectly inelastic demand. On the other hand, these are other ones that come on the test that people tend to get wrong. We have perfectly inelastic supply and perfectly elastic supply. Perfectly inelastic supply means the seller pays the entire tax. If I am going to produce, like I already have the production line set up, it's going to be way too expensive for me to turn it off now. No matter what, that production line is going to produce 6, what do we got here? Hard drives, right? The production line is going to produce 6 hard drives. It's way too expensive for me to turn it off. So I'm relatively inelastic right now, right? I'm not going to lower the amount because it's too expensive to turn off the machines. I can't raise the amount because it's too expensive to buy a machine. So I have a perfectly inelastic supply. Well, in that case, then I, as the seller, am going to pay the entire tax because I can't change my production that quickly. If my production is going to be the same, then I'm going to have to sell those 6 hard drives. And it can be for more or it can be for less. I'm probably going to have to pay the tax though, because we're limited by how much I'm producing and I can't really change. If it's a perfectly elastic supply, so maybe instead of that, I'm producing not so great pens. You know, I really wanted these S gels to be good. I really did. They were disappointing. Okay, anyways, let's say it's perfectly elastic supply. So I'm like, okay, I can produce these for like $1. But if it costs me $1.01 to produce them, I'm stopping because I'm done. That's a perfectly elastic supply. I need a certain price for this. And if the price goes down, like if you pay me 99 cents and it costs me $1, like we're not working together, things like that. Well, if it's perfectly elastic and I as the seller am very willing to change my production based upon differences in price, the buyer's going to have to take the entire tax. It's going to really be on them because they're going to have to pay for it or else the seller's no longer going to be able to produce. If I have to have $1 for this and the tax went up, I can't pay my money out of the $1. Maybe the buyers are going to have to pay the additional tax if they keep wanting to get these pens. The more elastic the supply, The more elastic the supply is, the larger is the buyer's share of the tax. So here we have the idea of elastic supply. If we shift this entire demand downwards, we see that we still have the same quantity amount, right? If we have the same quantity amount, that means the supplier is really paying this difference in the tax if we shift up and down. In a perfectly elastic case, we have this very elastic supplier. If we shift demand for the purpose of a tax, if we shift it down, well, there's still this one price that's going to be their equilibrium, right? So if we shift this line, the equilibrium price and the new equilibrium price and quantity is still going to be at the same price level. They're still going to have to get that price level for the seller, which means that that difference for the tax, that's going to have to be something that's on the buyer. So taxes in practice. Taxes usually are levied on goods and services with inelastic demand or supply, right? Why do we tax alcohol, cigarettes, firearms, gambling? There's a lot of taxes when it comes to gambling, different types of medical care, different types of so on and so forth. It's because people aren't willing to change, right? Oh, gasoline. Gasoline's a good one. Why do we tax gas? It's because people are going to drive the same amount. It doesn't matter if there's a 5-cent tax or a 30-cent tax or a $2 tax. People still drive about the same amount, right? Which means that it's very predictable. If we put this on goods with inelastic demands or inelastic supplies, that tends to mean things that you can't really change the amount that you're supplying, or things that tend to be a little addictive. Well, then we know how much tax revenue we're going to get. The quantity is not going to change much, and we're still able to take portions for the tax with quantities that don't change much. We can still have a pretty big rectangle for tax revenue. Labor has a low elasticity of supply, right? So the seller, i.e. the worker who's selling their labor to the system, they pay most of the income tax. Why do you pay most of the income tax instead of every time that there's a tax change and your taxes go up, your job raises your income to match it? It's because you have a low elasticity. You can go to other firms. You can work for different amounts. So most of the income tax and most of the Social Security tax is going to end up getting paid by you, right? Because the number of jobs, that's relatively fixed. Let's think about taxes and fairness. So we have our two fairness principles. We have our results idea of everybody at the end, we're going to make them equal. And we have the rules idea of everybody at the beginning, we're going to make them equal and let them go off on their own. We also have two conflicting principles of fairness when we apply them to the tax system. So finding a fair tax is very, very difficult. I know we're in the state of Illinois and there's legislation about a fair tax. That is not what I'm talking about when I say a fair tax. So please do not think about that idea. But okay, so there's two principles of fairness that when we try to apply to a tax system. The first is the benefits principle. The second is the ability to pay principle. The first one, the benefits principle, is the idea. It's the proposition that people should pay taxes equal to the benefit that they receive from a government or from a service that's provided by a government. For example, if you go to the park and it's just the best part of your life and you are so happy, maybe your benefit's like $5 worth of happiness, you pay that $5 worth of happiness. If someone else goes to the park and they're like, I could take it or leave it, like this was okay, I guess, but I'm not that happy. Maybe I get 50 cents worth of happiness. They pay 50 cents to get into the park. Where your price of something, your tax for using this government resource is equal to the benefit level you get. For the people who really, really, really like the park, pay more taxes for the park than the people that are like on the park that pay less taxes for the price of the park. This arrangement tends to be really fair because it means that people who benefit the most pay the most taxes for something. The problem is that conflicts with the other idea of fairness in taxes, which is the ability to pay principle. The ability to pay principle is the idea that people should pay taxes according to how easily they can afford the burden of the tax. One person might really, 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 really love the park, and they get $4 of enjoyment out of it, but maybe $4 is a lot. Maybe they only make like $9 an hour, so $4 is actually a lot of that. Maybe they can't pay it very easily. While the person who's meh who gets 50 cents of enjoyment. Maybe they're a multi-millionaire who makes like thousands of dollars an hour. 50 cents or $4, those are basically nothing to them, right? The ability to pay principle is saying, okay, well, maybe the person who can't really afford this tax, they pay less. And then the person who can really afford this tax, they pay more. We'll see that these conflict, right? Because in the benefits principle, the person who benefited more pays more than the person who didn't benefit as much. In the other situation, in my other example, the person who benefited more actually pays less taxes because they have less money, but the person who benefits less, who's all meh, they pay a lot more because they have more money. They have more ability to pay for something. These are conflicting ideas. And most of the fight on taxes that happens, most of the economic debates surrounding taxes since the early 1900s has been based upon trying to figure out the fairness perspective of it. Which one of these two economic principles should take precedence, or how do you work them even together when they are often conflicting? If you have a good answer, a Nobel Prize is in your future, but right now it's something that we don't know, and it's something that a lot of really good economists are trying to figure out. So let's say that we don't have taxes. Okay, so taxes is the first part. Notice that these were regulations that dealt with prices. So they adjusted the price factor of something. It was limits on how much do we charge, how little do we charge, how much of the price needs to go to the government. But there's also another type of regulation. This one's on the quantity aspect. So this is the idea of production quotas and production subsidies. Quotas and subsidies are just interventions in markets for farms, which we normally see in farms, right? We do have them in other goods, but I'm going to talk about farming because like 90% of the time when we see these, they're in farming. But it's interventions in markets for farm products, and they typically take two different perspectives. The first one's a production quota. A production quota is an upper limit to the quantity of a good that can be produced during a specific time. Maybe I produce wheat. Actually, that's like one of the only crops I don't grow. I'm growing garlic. I just spent all morning like putting down all my garlic because I'm planting it over winter. So let's talk about garlic. Okay, let's say that there's a production quota. I can produce up to 500 garlics. But after that, there's a limit. There's a production quota of 500. The government says I can only produce 500. If I go over 500, that is no good. I will get a big fine. So I can produce up to 500. That's a quota. I can produce 200. I can produce 300. I can produce 499, but 500 is my upper limit. I cannot produce 502. I will be in trouble. That's a production quota. Then there's the idea of a subsidy. The subsidy is kind of the opposite of a tax. A tax is money that you pay to a government for a good or service. A subsidy is money paid to you by the government for a good or service. It's a lot of the time when we want to encourage people to use something. Why does the government tend to pay for a lot of the flu vaccine? Or why do private companies tend to pay a lot for the flu vaccine so that your cost is either free or very, very small? It's because they want more people to get flu shots, right? So they subsidize it. They put money into it to try to make the quantity increase by making it technically less expensive to the people who are buying it. So that's subsidies. All right, let's go through these two different examples. Let's say that we have a quota. Let's say that we are in, millions of tons. We're in the millions of tons of garlic, right? Maybe I decide to no longer be a professor and I get some land and I start producing garlic in droves instead of just in these multiple like raised beds along my back porch. Let's say that our equilibrium quantity and price would be 60 million tons of garlic being produced for $30 a ton. And that's where we would be. The thing is, if we have $30 a ton, that's not a lot of money. Farmers can't get rich like that, right? That means that they're having to produce a lot of stuff for very, very small returns. This has giant implications for international markets, for trade, for the well-being of farmers. So a lot of the time, what the government likes to do is they like to put in production quotas, or these upper limits of what you actually can produce. The reason they do that isn't to be mean to farmers. It's not to say, hey, you can only produce 500 cloves of garlic, or how dare you. and to like bully the farmers. The reason for why they do that is because they know if they reduce this quantity, well, what happens when we have a reduction in quantity? Prices go up because there's less of something, right? So they do that to keep the price of garlic high. They do that to keep the price of wheat high or the price of corn high, so that when they're sold, farmers make more money. And since farmers are having to produce less, right? Like for example, in this, where we see this production quota is at 40. So if there's 40 tons of garlic and that's all we can produce, then I don't have to pay for the machines to get to 60 million garlics. I don't have to pay for the workers to get to 60 million garlics. I only have to pay for the workers to get to 40 million, which means let's look at where this hits on supply and demand. We move inwards and we see we have the quota line. We move up from this quota line of 40. We see that we intersect supply at $20 per ton. That's because when I'm supplying it, well, I'm not having to pay for all the equipment that I would have had for 60 tons of garlic. I'm only producing 40 tons of garlic. So my cost is actually less than what it would be in the natural equilibrium. And then we continue to trace it up. We see that we hit demand at $50. That's because there's less stuff in the system, right? If we have less quantity, well, the law of demand says if we have less quantity, that price has to go up. So that means that people are going to pay $50 for each ton of garlic. But if we look at the difference, it's $50 they're paying for each ton of garlic, but it doesn't cost us $50 to make each ton of garlic. The cost has actually fallen. So we see that this is our equilibrium price in a system with no rules. We see that the price in the market is higher than this amount, and we see that the cost is lower than this amount. The thing is, this is still inefficient though, right? Like that sounds really cool. The farmers are making more money. The costs have gone down, but the thing is there's now only 40 million tons of garlic when the market really, really wanted 60 million tons of garlic, which means that there's some people who may not have had all that much money, but really, really needed garlic or wheat for bread or corn or something else, that are no longer able to afford it because it's too expensive and there's a shortage of it. So that's something that we have to rationalize. These production quotas are really good for the money into farmers, but it's not necessarily very good for the system of people that want to buy them. And that's something that is tough to figure out. There's inefficiencies that are created by this. The marginal social benefit equals the market price, which is increased, and the marginal social cost has ended up decreasing. But production is inefficient and producers have an incentive to cheat, right? If you know that people are going to pay you $50 a ton of garlic, what's to stop you from maybe planting a couple more tons on the side and not telling the government and then taking those to market because you know you can get $50 for them? There's an incentive to cheat the system, right? The other side's subsidies. So remember when we had taxes, we either pushed the supply line upwards or we pushed the demand line downwards by the amount of that tax. Subsidies work the opposite. So for subsidies, we either push down the supply line by the amount that we're subsidizing, or we push up the demand line by the amount that we're subsidizing. This is government payments to make it a little bit cheaper on consumers because they want people to produce more of something. Let's say we have this example. Let's say that in equilibrium, we had 40 tons of garlic for $40. Okay, 40 tons of garlic for $40. Well, maybe the government's realized, wow, there's some health benefits of garlic. Maybe it helps like fight heart disease and other things. Maybe we want more people to eat garlic. So we're going to put in a subsidy of $20. We're going to do this to the supplier. For every single time they produce a ton of garlic and they sell it on the market, we're going to give them $20. Well, that's pretty cool, right? That brings my cost down, because if you're offsetting me by $20, then my cost has gone down really. So what we see here is that this difference in between our original supply line and our supply minus the subsidy line is this $20 difference. Now, if we go over to our new equilibrium, which is right here. So we had our original equilibrium at 40 and 40. Our new equilibrium is at 60 million tons for $30. That means that we are producing more garlic for a lower price at this new equilibrium. The price falls. It falls, right? We went from $40 to $30. Price goes down. Quantity goes up. We went from 40 million tons of garlic to 60 million tons of garlic. Quantity goes up. Okay, okay, okay. Take this new equilibrium and trace a line up to that original supply curve. Well, we see that at this level of garlic, it would cost me $50 to produce that level of garlic. I need to be paid because my marginal cost is $50 for producing another ton of garlic here. I would need to be paid at least $50. But the market price is $30. Well, the thing is that difference, that subsidy, that's additional money from the government, right? It cost me $50 to make the garlic. In the market, people are paying me $30. And then the government throws $20 on top of that when it comes back to me. So I'm making my $50 at that point. That's called a subsidy. It's when we're trying to have an overproduction of something. The thing is, this is still inefficient, right? We saw with taxes that sometimes we have inefficient underproduction. We're producing less of something. This is inefficient overproduction. We're producing more of something. Notice that a new triangle has been created. Take this point right here, this new equilibrium, and trace that line up to the original supply. Notice that we have this triangle right here. It's not on the left side, it's on the right side this time, but this is still deadweight loss. These are trades that are happening that shouldn't happen. That person who was willing to buy for $42, but the company would only sell it for $48, that trade should not happen. But it's happening now. And it's doing that because the government's kicking in some money. It's subsidizing this. This is called inefficient overproduction. So isn't that kind of neat? All right. With that, congratulations. You have now officially made it through all the Chapter 6 material. That means we are halfway through to your second midterm. Your second midterm covers chapters 5, 6, 16, and 17. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. If not, I will talk to you all soon. All right. Bye-bye.